James Hartley cut through the Grand train station with a stride that commanded attention, his tailored charcoal suit catching the golden morning light as it poured through towering glass windows. The station, a cathedral of marble and steel, thrummed, with the pulse of a city waking up, travelers hauling suitcases, announcements crackling over speakers, and the faint whistle of a departing train fading into the distance. In his left hand, James carried Lila Carter's silk purse, its delicate strap dangling from his fingers, an acto out of character for a man who never bore anyone's burdens, that it drew curious glances. Lila glided beside him, her emerald dress swaying with each step, a vision of spring in a place of cold efficiency, her auburn hair catching the light like a halo. At 25 she was an aspiring actress, her dreams pinned to the man beside her, her smile radiant with the certainty that this moment, being seen on James Hartley's arm, was her triumph. To her, the purse in his hand was a symbol, a quiet promise that she'd claimed a piece of his guarded heart. The crowd parted around them, their presence magnetic, executives in sharp suits, stealing glances, young women whispering behind their coffee cups, all captivated by the glamour of the pair. She adjusted her silk scarf, a nervous habit she thought went unnoticed, but James's sharp eyes missed nothing, though he gave no sign of care. His face was a mask of control, a practiced smile playing on his lips as he scanned the station, not for Lila, but for the narrative he wove for the world. To him this walk was a performance, a carefully staged display of power and charm, with Lila as the perfect accessory. A vendor called out hawking overpriced croissants, a child chased a runaway balloon, her laughter cutting through the hum of hurried conversations, and a businessman muttered into his phone, oblivious to the spectacle unfolding nearby. Lila reached for James's arm, her touch, light but deliberate, her fingers brushing the fine wool of his sleeve, and he allowed it, his smile tightening just enough to maintain the illusion. To Lila this was love, a moment of connection she'd replay in her mind for years to come. To James it was strategy, a move in a game he'd mastered long before her. She tilted her head, catching his profile again, her eyes tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble he'd allowed for a rugged edge. James's grip was casual, almost dismissive, as if the act cost him nothing, because to him it did. The platform for their private car loomed ahead, a sleek black carriage waiting to whisk them to a weekend of luxury. But Lila insisted on this public walk, craving the validation of being seen with him. James hadn't objected, his silence, a calculated agreement that let her believe she held sway. The station's energy seemed to bend to their will, travelers pausing to stare, phones subtly raised to capture the moment, a fleeting glimpse of a couple who seemed to own the world. She imagined headlines not yet written, stories of their love that would eclipse her struggling acting career, stories that would make her more than a name on a casting call sheet. But her heart too full of hope to notice the absence in his gaze. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. Her presence was enough to fuel the image he curated, a billionaire philanthropist with a beautiful woman on his arm. A man who carried a purse not out of devotion but because it fit the script. The station's clock ticked above them, its hands marking time. Lila thought belonged to her, but James knew better, his mind already 3 steps ahead, plotting moves in a game she didn't understand. As they neared the platform, Lila's hand tightened on his arm, her fingers trembling with the weight of her dreams, and for a moment she believed she'd won him, that the man who never carried anything for anyone was hers alone. The train station's vibrant hum froze, as if the air itself held its breath, the clatter of suitcases and chatter of travelers dissolving into a heavy silence that pressed against Lila Carter's skin. She stood beside James Hartley, her emerald dress suddenly too bright, her smile faltering as she sensed the shift before she saw its cause. James's hand still held her silk purse, but his grip slackened, his eyes narrowing as he followed the crowd's gaze to the far end of the platform. There, in the midst of the morning chaos, stood Clara Hartley, his wife, her presence like a shadow cast over the station's gleaming light. Clara was unadorned, her face pale with exhaustion, her dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, her plain coat a stark contrast to the polished marble beneath her feet. 3 small girls clung to her there, identical dresses, a soft blue that seemed to absorb the surrounding glow, their eyes wide with confusion as they gripped their mother's hands. The station's rhythm broke. Travelers paused mid-step, phones lifted not for calls but to capture the scene, whispers rippling like waves across the crowd. Lila's heart stuttered, her breath catching as she registered Clara's gaze, not fiery with anger but calm with a devastating clarity that cut deeper than rage. James's face drained of color, his usual control, unraveling as the purse slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft thud that echoed louder than the station's din. The girls, identical in their delicate features, looked up, one pointing a tiny finger at James, her voice small but piercing. "Daddy." The word was a blade twisting in Lila's chest, her triumph crumbling as she realized the truth she'd been too blind to see. James's mouth opened, but no sound came. His expensive suit, suddenly ill-fitting as sweat beaded on his brow, his empire of confidence, reduced to a man caught in a moment he couldn't script. "Is that his wife? Who's the woman with him?" Lila stepped back, her heels unsteady on the marble, her hands trembling as she clutched her scarf. The gesture no longer a nervous habit, but a desperate anchor. Clara didn't move, her eyes locked on James, not with hatred, but with a quiet pity that seemed to strip him bare, her silence louder than any scream. James's voice finally broke a hoarse plea, "Clara," but it was swallowed by the rising murmur of the crowd, the clicks of camera shutters, the hum of a station now alive with scandal. Lila's mind raced, replaying every promise James had made, every late-night whisper in his penthouse, where he'd called her his freedom, his truth, while never mentioning the 3 daughters, now staring at him. She felt the weight of every stare, not admiration now, but judgment, her role shifting from muse to intruder in a single heartbeat. Clara took a step forward, her movements deliberate, the girls trailing behind, their small steps uneven but trusting as they followed their mother's lead. She stopped just short of James, her voice low but clear enough to slice through the noise. "This is what you chose to carry." The words landed like a verdict, each syllable a wound that left James staggering, his hand reaching out only to grasp empty air. The crowd pressed closer, some recording, others murmuring their phones, turning the moment into a spectacle that would live beyond the station's walls. She wanted to speak, to explain that she didn't know, but her voice failed her, shame rooting her to the spot as Clara's gaze briefly met hers, not with malice but with a recognition that made Lila feel smaller than ever. Clara turned her attention back to her daughters, kneeling to adjust one's coat, her hands steady despite the chaos, her composure a shield against the flashing lights. James stood frozen, his mind spinning through excuses, plans, contingencies, none of which fit this raw, unscripted truth. The girls looked at him, their faces a mix of hope and confusion, one reaching out only to pull back when Clara gently guided her hand away. The station's announcements resumed, a mechanical voice calling out a departing train, but it felt distant, irrelevant, as the crowd's focus remained on the family they hadn't known existed. Clara stood, her daughters gathered close, and began to walk away, her steps measured, her head high, as if the weight of the moment couldn't touch her. James called out again, "Clara, wait," but she didn't falter, her silhouette fading into the crowd as the cameras followed her, leaving James and Lila in the wreckage of their own making. The city's pulse beat on, indifferent to the wreckage left in the train station. But for James Hartley, Lila Carter, and Clara Hartley, time seemed to splinter, each fragment trapping them in their own private unraveling. In his glass-walled penthouse high above the skyline, James sat alone, the city's lights flickering like a taunt beyond the windows, his empire's glow dimmed by the morning's catastrophe. The news played on a loop across multiple screens, grainy footage of Clara and the girls dominating every channel, the headlines slicing into his legacy, tech titan's secret family exposed. His phone buzzed with messages from advisors, shareholders, and PR teams, but he ignored them, his eyes fixed on a single frame, Clara's face, steady and unyielding, as she led their daughters away. He hadn't known them, not really. Their names Zima, Sophie, and Lily learned from news reports rather than memory. Their faces unfamiliar, except as echoes of Clara's. His hands shook as he poured a whiskey, the glass cold against his palm, but he didn't drink, the act feeling hollow, like everything else in the room. Across town, in a sterile hotel suite, Lila curled into herself on a velvet sofa, the curtains drawn tight against the world that now knew her as the mistress who shattered a family. Her phone lay silent, its screen cracked from a fall she didn't remember. Notifications piling up with venomous comments, gold digger, homewrecker each, one a knife twisting in her chest. She replayed James's promises, his voice soft in the dim of his penthouse, telling her she was his escape, the one who understood him, while never mentioning the daughters who called him daddy. Her modeling contracts had vanished within hours, brands citing values in statements that burned her name to ash, her dreams of stardom now a cruel joke trending online. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to block out Clara's face. Not angry but resolute. A woman who carried her pain with a grace Leela couldn't fathom. The silence in the suite was suffocating, broken only by her uneven breaths, each one a reminder of her complicity in a story she hadn't written but had willingly played a part in. Meanwhile, in a modest safe house tucked in a quiet suburb, Clara sat on a worn leather couch, a steaming mug of tea untouched on the table before her. The room was sparse, its bare walls and blackout curtains a stark contrast to the mansion she'd once called home. But it felt safer, a refuge where her daughters slept soundly in the next room. Her lawyer, Elise Warren, sat across from her, notepad idle, her eyes steady as Clara spoke in a voice that held no tremor, only truth. She recounted the years of James's control, how he'd locked her accounts during her pregnancies, forbade public appearances, and dismissed their daughters as inconveniences to his image. When she'd found out about his first affair, not Lila, but another before her, James had turned it on her, calling her paranoid, unstable, until she doubted her own mind. The girls, born early after a grueling labor, had never known their father's touch. James hadn't come to the hospital, hadn't even asked their names. Clara's hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, but her voice remained even, as if recounting someone else's life. Elise listened, her jaw tight, recognizing the weight of Clara's restraint, a strength forged in silence and survival. Clara's gaze drifted to the closed bedroom door, where Emma, Sophie, and Lily slept, their small forms tangled in blankets, safe for now from the chaos their father had wrought. She didn't cry, didn't falter, but her words carried a resolve that chilled the room. She would protect her daughters, not just from James but from the world he'd shaped around them. Outside, the safe house's security lights blinked, a reminder of the vigilance she now lived by, but Clara felt no fear, only a clarity that had been buried too long. His assistant hovered, delivering news of a plummeting stock price, but James waved him off. His mind caught on the girls' faces, their confusion a mirror to his own. He'd built an empire on control, but now it slipped through his fingers, not because of a scandal but because of a woman who refused to stay invisible. In her hotel, Leela's tears fell silently, her hands clutching the scarf she'd worn that morning, its silk now a reminder of her blindness. She wanted to call James, to beg for answers, but Clara's presence lingered, a warning that love was a lie she'd bought to isolate. In the safe house, Clara stood, her tea cold, her eyes fixed on the future she'd fight for, a future where her daughters would know their worth. Each of them, James, Lila, Clara, sat alone, their worlds fractured, their truths exposed, the city's pulse beating on without them. The air in the law office's private meeting room was thick with tension, the muted hum of the city beyond its frosted glass walls, unable to penetrate the silence that hung between Leela Carter and Clara Hartley. Leela stood by the window, her fingers twisting the hem of her plain sweater, a far cry from the emerald dress she'd worn days ago, her face bare of makeup, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights, haunted by the train station's fallout. She'd sent the note to Clara in a desperate bid for truth, expecting rejection, but Clara had come alone, her presence filling the room like a storm held at bay. Clara stood across from her, her tailored coat draped over a chair, her posture impeccable yet not cold, her dark eyes steady as they studied Lila with neither judgment nor warmth. The room was stark, a single oak table between them, its surface reflecting the pale light of a desk lamp. Leela's voice broke first, a fractured whisper. "I didn't know about your daughters, Clara, I swear," her words tumbling out, raw with shame, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her chest. Clara's expression didn't shift, but she tilted her head slightly, a gesture that invited Lila to continue, yet promised no absolution. Lila sank into a chair, her breath hitching as she recounted James's promises late nights in his penthouse, his voice soft as he called her his muse, his freedom, words she'd clung to like lifelines, blind to the family he'd hidden. Clara listened, her silence a blade, cutting through Leela's defenses until she was laid bare. Sobbing, "I thought I was special." Clara finally spoke, her voice low, measured, each word deliberate. "I was 24 when I met James, just like you." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through Lila's heart as Clara continued, her tone even but heavy with memory. She described a younger James, charming, magnetic, promising her the world while slowly caging His lover transaction she hadn't recognized until it was too late. When she'd fallen pregnant with the girls, he'd called it bad timing, isolating her in a mansion with no access to money or friends, her world shrinking to fit his narrative. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but not kind. He told me I was his escape to Lila, but I was just a role he needed filled until the next one came along. The words broke something in Lila, her sobs turning silent, her body shaking as she saw herself not as James's partner but as his pawn, a placeholder in a game she'd never understood. Clara didn't comfort her, didn't reach out, but offered a choice, her words sharp with clarity. You can stay, beg for his scraps, or you can leave before he takes what's left of you. Across the city, in his glass-walled office, James Hartley sat behind a desk littered with crisis reports, his empire bleeding value as shareholders fled and headlines screamed betrayal. His assistant delivered the news that Clara had hired Elise Warren, a lawyer known not for settlements but for dismantling powerful men, and James's jaw tightened, his mind racing to regain control. He ordered a generous offer, cash property, anything to silence Clara, but doubt gnawed at him, a rare intruder in his calculated world. His gaze fell on a small photo on his desk, one he'd ignored for years. 3 tiny girls, premature, their faces barely formed, a hospital snapshot. He'd never asked for. He didn't know who'd placed it there, perhaps a long-gone assistant, but now it stared back, a reminder of daughters he'd never held. Their names, Sophie, Lily, learned from news reports, not love. His fingers brushed the frame, not with affection but with confusion, as if touching it could explain why he'd chosen power over them. Back in the meeting room, Lila looked up at Clara, her voice a broken whisper. Why did you come? Clara's gaze softened, just for a moment, a flicker of something almost maternal passing through her eyes. So you wouldn't repeat my mistakes, she said, her words carrying the weight of years spent silent, years spent invisible. She stood, smoothing her coat, and moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. When he calls you, and he will, don't answer, she said, her voice firm, final. He only calls to win. Then she was gone, leaving Lila alone, her sobs echoing in the empty room. The choice Clara offered burning in her mind, stay in James's shadow or find a way out. In his office, James stared at the city below, its lights mocking his fading control, the photo of his daughters a silent accusation he couldn't answer. The confrontation had shifted something irreversible. For Lila, a path to escape. For James, a mirror to his failures. And for Clara, a step toward reclaiming her voice. The courtroom's air was heavy with anticipation, its high ceilings and polished wood benches amplifying every sound, from the shuffle of papers to the soft coughs of the packed gallery, where reporters and onlookers leaned forward, hungry for the next chapter of James Hartley's unraveling. Clara Hartley sat beside her lawyer, Elise Warren, her black dress tailored to a quiet elegance, her face a mask of calm resolve, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Across the room, James sat rigid, his once commanding presence diminished, his suit pristine but his eyes hollow, as if the man who'd built an empire had already begun to fade. The judge's voice cut through the tension, inviting Clara to speak, and she rose, her movements deliberate, her gaze fixed not on James but on the future she was carving for her daughters. I am not here for money, she began, her voice clear, resonant, slicing through the room's murmurs like a blade through silk. I am here for my children, Ma, Sophie, and Lily. The gallery stirred, pencils scratching furiously, as Clara laid bare the truth of James's absence, her words unflinching, how he'd locked her accounts during her pregnancies, barred her from public life, and never once visited the hospital when their daughters were born premature, their tiny bodies fighting for survival without his presence. She presented evidence, bank records, staff testimonies, medical logs, each document a brick in the wall she built against him, her voice steady as she recounted his refusal to acknowledge their daughters, calling them complications to his empire. The judge's eyes narrowed, the gallery gasped, and even Elise, seasoned and stoic, shifted slightly, struck by Clara's precision, her pain transformed into power. James's lawyer attempted a defense, spinning tales of miscommunication and corporate pressures, but the words fell flat, drowned by the weight of Clara's testimony, her final statement ringing out, I'm not asking for justice, I'm taking it. She sat, her composure unbroken, and the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence louder than any verdict. Across the city, Leila Carter watched the proceedings on a flickering hotel TV, her packed suitcase by the door, her decision made. In the wake of Clara's words, she'd booked a bus ticket to a small coastal town, a place James would never look, her modeling dreams discarded like the silk scarf she'd left behind. The headlines branded her the Mistress, but Clara's warning "don't answer his call" had ignited a spark of defiance, a resolve to rebuild away from his shadow. She turned off the TV, her reflection in the blank screen showing a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes clearer, her shoulders squared, ready to vanish before James could claim more of her soul. Back in the courtroom, the judge's ruling came. Swiftly, full custody to Clara. Control of the girl's substantial trust fund transferred to her authority. James granted visitation rights he'd never use. Clara's face remained blank, her victory not in triumph but in freedom. While James sat motionless, his lawyer's assurances fading into background noise. As the gavel fell, Elise touched Clara's arm, whispering, "It's done." But Clara's eyes held no joy, only the quiet strength of a woman who'd reclaimed her life. Outside, reporters surged, their questions a chaotic roar. But Clara walked through them, her daughters waiting in a car nearby, their laughter a distant promise of healing. James lingered in the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the empty bench where Clara had sat, her absence more punishing than any words. He stepped into the sunlight, cameras flashing, voices shouting, "Mr. Hartley, do you deny neglecting your children?" But he had no answers, his empire crumbling, not from scandal but from the truth Clara had laid bare. In his office later, James stared at the city he'd once owned, its skyline now a reminder of his losses, his phone silent, his offer to buy Clara's silence unanswered. The photo of his daughters remained on his desk, their faces accusing, strangers he'd chosen not to know. Across town, Lila boarded her bus, the city receding as she leaned against the window, her heart heavy but her path clear, each mile a step toward a life untainted by James's lies. Clara, in the safe house, tucked her daughters into bed, their small hands clutching hers, their trust a balm to wounds she'd carried too long. The world outside churned with headlines, Valen wins, Hartley falls, but Clara didn't watch, her focus on the girls' steady breathing, their futures now hers to shape. James, alone, poured a drink he didn't touch, the glass reflecting a man he no longer recognized, his legacy reduced to a story he couldn't control. The courtroom had been a reckoning, not just for him but for all three, Clara claiming her power, Lila choosing escape, James facing the void of his choices. The city moved on, its pulse relentless, but for them, this moment was a turning point, a severance from the past, and a step toward futures they'd define on their own terms. The park was a small, unremarkable patch of green tucked between the city's concrete sprawl, its swings creaking softly under the weight of children, its benches worn smooth by years of quiet moments. Clara Hartley sat on one such bench, her coat folded neatly beside her, her eyes following Emma, Sophie, and Lily as they darted through the grass, their laughter rising like bubbles in the crisp afternoon air. The girls were distinct now in Clara's heart, Emma's bold climbs up the slide, Sophie's twirls in her mismatched socks, Lily's gentle negotiations over a shared toy knot, the identical shadows James had dismissed but individuals blooming in the safety Clara had fought for. The park's simplicity was a balm, its ordinariness a refuge from the cameras and headlines that had trailed her since the courtroom, a place where she could breathe without the weight of being Evelyn Hartley, the woman who toppled a titan. She leaned back, her hands resting lightly on her lap, the faint scar on her wrist a remnant of a stressful pregnancy catching the sunlight, a reminder of battles won. Across the city, in a coastal town where gulls wheeled over a grey sea, Lila Carter walked a boardwalk, her short hair ruffling in the salty breeze, her face bare of the makeup that once defined her. She'd found work in a bookstore, shelving novels and brewing coffee, her days quiet but her nights no longer haunted by James's voice or the venom of online mobs. The scandal had faded from her new world, her name no longer trending, her past a shadow she was learning to outrun. She carried a paperback in her pocket, its pages dog-eared, a story of redemption she read when doubt crept in, her steps lighter now, each one a choice to claim a life unscripted by betrayal. Back in the park, Clara's gaze softened as Sophie tripped and laughed, dusting off her knees, her resilience a mirror to her mother's. Clara hadn't answered Elise's question about why she chose this park, but the truth was simple. It was honest, untouched by James's world of glass and power, a place where her daughters could be children, not symbols. The news still buzzed with her name: charity galas, children's health initiatives, her quiet advocacy reshaping her public image. But here, she was just Mama, her presence enough. A shadow crossed her vision, and Clara looked up, her breath catching as Lila stood across the path, her simple jeans and sweater blending into the crowd, her eyes clear but heavy with memory. Time slowed, the park's sounds fading, the squeal of swings, the crunch of leaves, leaving only the weight of their shared history. Lila's lips trembled, not with tears but with a fragile relief. Her nod, small but deliberate, an acknowledgement of survival, of pain endured and overcome. Clara returned the gesture, her face unreadable but her eyes soft, a silent understanding passing between them. Two women broken by the same man, now standing in their own light. Lila turned, walking away, her silhouette fading down the path, her future unwritten but hers alone. Clara watched until she was gone, then turned back to her daughters. Lily now braiding grass into a crown, her focus a quiet miracle. In a cliffside villa far from the city's heart, James Hartley sat in a leather chair, the ocean beyond his glass walls churning under a blood-red sunset. The villa was silent, its staff moving like ghosts, its luxury a hollow echo of the empire he'd lost. The television played endlessly, not market reports or tech breakthroughs, but clips of Clara, her speeches, her daughters' faces growing older in every frame, their laughter a sound he'd never earned. He rewound her courtroom words again. "I'm not asking for justice, I'm taking it." Her voice a ghost that haunted his nights. The photo of Emma, Sophie, and Lily remained on his desk, its edges curling, their premature faces a puzzle he couldn't solve. He'd whispered to the empty room, "I could have been there," but the words dissolved into the silence, unanswered, because no one cared. His phone hadn't rung in months, his name erased from invitations, his power reduced to a memory the world no longer needed. He poured a bourbon, its amber glow catching the light, but left it untouched, the act as meaningless as the wealth that surrounded him. In the park, Emma ran to Clara, her hands full of dandelions, her grin wide, and Clara laughed, a sound rare and real, pulling her daughter close. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, but Clara felt no rush, no fear, only the certainty that her daughters would grow knowing their worth, their voices never silenced as hers once was. Lila, miles away, paused on the boardwalk, watching the horizon, a smile tugging at her lips as she realized she no longer looked back. James pressed play again, Clara's face filling the screen, her strength a mirror to his emptiness, and for the first time, he understood, he wasn't the story anymore. Clara was, her daughters were, and Lila, in her quiet escape, was the park's laughter rose again, the villa's silence deepened, and the world turned, leaving James behind, a man who'd carried the wrong burdens and lost what mattered most.